Yeah, I'm probably interested in both of those issues, the weighting of criteria as well as the invoicing. Thank you.
Yep. Thank you. Nicholas Plowman, Acting First Assistant Secretary Commercial. So my area looks after all the commercial policy frameworks, templates, and we're fairly heavily engaged on all these ANAO audits that are impacting on procurement processes to make sure that we're adopting the ANAO recommendations. So to the firstly to the weighting of criteria. We deal with very complex procurements that have a number of factors that sort of bleed into the overall decision making and value for money assessments. We've got a guidance documentation in our Defence Commercial Framework, including the Tender Evaluation and Complex Procurement Better Practice Guide, which actually recommends that when you're undertaking fairly complex procurements with a range of considerations that will lead into a value for money consideration, that you should not necessarily go down the path of quantitative evaluations or use weightings, and rather use qualitative assessments, which is pretty standard for these highly complex procurement processes. I'll give an example. If you've got a tendering process where you've got hypothetically 10 criteria and each are weighted equally, and each might be scored out of 10, so it all sums up to 100. You might have a tenderer that's like all great in terms of commercial compliance, really competitive pricing. It might have great sort of local content in terms of Australian industry content, but it might actually not deliver the capability that you require. So if you go through a quantitative assessment process, they might be scoring, 10s across all of the criteria, but then score really badly on the capability. That might lead you down to a situation where, like, holistically, that might be the winning tender, but at the end of the day, as a delegate, it wouldn't represent value for money because you're not meeting the 4 E's of the PGPA, particularly around efficient and effective use of Commonwealth resources, because you're not going to get the outcome that you need, even if it's cheaper and represents a greater level of compliance. So in our evaluation...
So would that not mean that you weight capability as... it doesn't have to be quantitative, surely it can be qualitative.
So our qualitative processes, we have published criteria, we'll release it to industry, we'll evaluate against that, we characterise that they're not in any sort of order priority because they're non-weighted. We'll evaluate that and we'll produce an evaluation report that's talking to each and every criteria. And all of those are presented to typically a tender evaluation board, who will then sort of consider it holistically, and they'll go through each of the criteria. ANAO sort of talked to I think the 10 or so criteria against the Land 400 Phase 3 procurement process, and where each of the tenderers were ranked. But there might be some criteria that might be fairly close or line ball, but you still might say that they're either equally rated against that criteria, or there might be one that's slightly preferred than the other. But at the end of the day, the evaluation board will sort of take all that information and determine, based on what's been presented to them, what represents value for money, so that there might be 8 of the 10 criteria that might have been line ball or not necessarily driven to like any sort of level of heavy discrimination between them. But in the Land 400 Phase 3 case, it was that technical capability and the pricing that were the key discriminators, but it was still looking at the full criteria and then justifying the value for money assessment based on all of the criteria together.
So would it be your feedback to the ANAO that in relation to that observation that perhaps a standard procurement weighting process is not appropriate in defence?
I think, there's definitely examples where it's fairly simple and, you might be dealing with pure off-the-shelf. So, it might be more suitable to have a quantitative assessment process and weightings. But just typically these sorts of procurement processes where there's so many factors that are going into the decision-making and so many trade-offs that we've got to make in terms of, delivering a project and capability to the warfighter, that having that qualitative assessment process sort of enables us to look at everything holistically and make recommendations in the report to the delegate of what represents best value for money, taking into consideration all the assessments against all the criteria.
Thank you. I guess that, the more complex the procurement, the more that we want to know that people have a clear decision framework in their head when they're, in the process, rather than, we don't want it to be the vibe, so to speak, and I'm not in any way implying that's the case, but, I guess the purpose, and I know you know this, the purpose of having a clear weighting and framework is to make sure that decisions are made in a systemic way. So, yeah, but thank you for your answer. I'll hand back to the chair. Sorry, did you want to answer the second recommendation? Invoice payment one. Yep.
Yeah, sure. So we've just taken some steps, based on the ANAO recommendations. So we've reviewed our ASDEFCON contracting suite, which we use for mostly capability projects, and can confirm that they all align currently with the government policy payment terms of 20 calendar days and 5 calendar days if doing through the electronic invoicing, or what we call PEPOL. We're also including sort of a greater assurance within centrally of looking at spot checks and checks across the organisation in terms of compliance with the payment terms, and then using that to sort of, inject ourselves from a commercial division perspective to areas that might need some assistance in terms of, upskilling their people and for people to understand their contract obligations. We have the Enterprise Resource Program, the ERP system, has a number of checks built in to understand what the earliest date of the invoices are received from suppliers. That's automatically calculated by the system but manually checked by business areas as part of our defence invoice approval process and the accounts payable team. So we'll check whether or not those business areas, if the invoice dates have been identified as the late payment penalty interest process, and will be, obligated to pay that supplier interest if we've paid things late. So we've got sort of a number of, template and policy positions that align with whole of government processes, and, using systems and our assurance function within commercial division to, monitor the health of this across defence and provide support in terms of if people are failing to pay invoices on time.